Good afternoon, my name is Liz, and I would like to just jump right in and start talking about Robert Frank. He is a Swiss-American photographer and director, well known for his ironic, expressive, moody, and visually raw style of street photography. Born in Switzerland, November of 1924, his photo career began with an apprenticeship in 1941 with Hermann Sugesser, a photographer who lived in his family's apartment building. He then gained a job working for a commercial photographer, Michael Wolgensinger. Wolgensinger introduced him to the magazine and publishing industry. Frank took this experience and created 40 photos, a hand-bound volume of photographs that resemble his influences and styles picked up in his early years of photography. These photos depict modernism, reportage, and the simplicity of Swiss life. After this, Frank emigrated to New York at age 23 to escape the small-minded values he saw in his country. He was hired by Harper's Bazaar as a fashion photographer. Here, he worked closely with Alexei Brodovich, an American magazine art director, graphic designer, and photographer who kept the magazine layouts dynamic and interesting, like this one shown here. Shooting with a 35mm Leica, he felt too limited in fashion and left only a few months later in 1948. From here, he did some freelance photojournalist work for Vogue and McCall's magazines. After working in fashion, he decided to travel. Spending time in Europe in his 20s, he focused on culture and people, like flowers in Paris, bankers in London, and miners in Wales. His friend, Allen Ginsberg, a poet, noticed that Frank invented a new way of seeing: spontaneous glance, accidental truth. He did many series of photos in hopes to be published in Life or other big magazines, but none were interested at that time. Instead, he continued to bind his own books and carry on. One of his hand-bound projects was called Mary's Book, consisting of 72 photos of this artist and dancer. This book was made in 1949, and they got married in 1950. They then moved to Paris to live somewhere with much beauty and romance, in Frank's words. And they had 2 children together, Pablo on the right and Andrea on the left. And Mary's in the back there with Pablo. In 1953, Frank and his family returned to New York, frustrated that none of his photos were being published. He applied for a fellowship through the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation to photograph the U.S. as a visual study of civilization. By then, he acquired many letters of recommendation by well-known photographers like Walker Evans, Steichen, and Brodovich. In 1955, he hits the road, traveling 10,000 miles in 9 months across the U.S. He'd go alone, or his wife and 2 kids would meet up with him and travel a little bit as well. And this was the book that he developed. Over this trip, he used 767 rolls of film, went through 27,000 frames, then edited them down to 1,000 prints. This book, The Americans, ended up being a revolutionary step in photojournalism. America, to Frank, seemed to be extremely mobile, constant transportation through railway and highway systems, people shuffling around constantly through the city, and in another way, through their goals. The American way of working emphasizes climbing the ladder socially and economically. Frank dug deeper into the non-mobile American blue-collar working classes who seemed to be oblivious to the whirligig of a mobile society. Frank said they seemed to have an organic connection with their environment. I think this picture kind of resembles that in a way. Sure, there's someone kind of with a fancier dress and hair all done, but the focus is on the people in the background, and those are kind of your average Americans instead of the glorified ones. He photographed lots of jukeboxes, TVs, and radios because that's what brought pop culture to these types of Americans. The only mobile person in this book appeared to be Robert Frank himself, traveling around so much. When the book was published in the US in 1959, a year after being published in France, it did not settle well. It was very controversial. Frank had a carefree attitude, and when paired with his idea of the American culture, it came off as showing the least attractive aspects of America and was looked at as an attack on the US almost. Although shocking to the US at the time, The Americans is now a template for a new style of photography, encouraging provocative, sarcastic, and edgy ways of photographing things to resemble political, social innuendos to get people talking. He skipped cliches and documented the truth. I have a couple contact sheets here that I found of Frank's, and turned out to be some really well-known pictures, but it's kind of nice to see those before and afters, the progress. This is the first photo in The Americans, the book he published. Pretty powerful that you can't really recognize the people behind the flag, and all you really see is the flag. And this is one that didn't quite make it into The Americans. He had many, many photos that didn't make it in. This is his family, but just a very nice shot of different, the news and flag. Yeah, it's good. So, restlessness and risk-taking led him away from photography and into avant-garde filmmaking. His first film, Pull My Daisy, documented things that everyone was doing but not talking about, mostly sex and drugs, which was later brought out more in the later 60s. He also made a film called Me and My Brother. It's about a man and his brother who is in the mental hospital. It's really like stark, dark composition. Pretty interesting. While filmmaking, he also published an autobiography called The Lines of My Hand, a photo collection of his life so far. In 1971, he had divorced, remarried, and moved to Nova Scotia. 1 year later, he creates a Rolling Stones documentary, and this is what it's called, yes. It mostly consists of their life on the road in their tour, mostly a lot of drug use, sex, and a lot of boredom as well of traveling. The explicitness of the film resulted in America banning it. If the film was shown in America, the Stones wouldn't be allowed in the country again. So to protect themselves, the Stones sued So even though Mick Jagger himself thought that the movie was a really great film, they weren't allowed to play it. That's Frank on the left, Mick Jagger on the right. Unfortunately, in 1974, Andrea, his daughter, was on a plane to Guatemala when it crashed and she passed away. And around that same time, his son Pablo was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And Frank's work became kind of dark after these sad events. He starts writing on the film directly, pairing with gritty, dark, and kind of grungy exposures. Pablo, here on the right, his son passed later in 1994. And these ones he even like etches. He's not drawing. This is like etching into the film. His more recent photos have been in one-person exhibitions, including the National Gallery of Art's, it's called Robert Frank Moving Out in 1994. And this is a recent film called Leaving Home, Coming Home. This is just the trailer I'd like to share with you.
New York is a very good city. I liked it a lot for a long time. I'm contemplating of moving out. I've been here long enough. It is totally changing. The yuppies, they have a right to live too, but I don't want to live next to them. If you have some brain and some feeling for people, you're going to be a good photographer.
Robert is like a man with chopsticks, and he watches and watches, and then he takes the two chopsticks and he just picks the most lasting, essential thing out of the chaos.
Sorry, we keep running out of film and battery. Robert, I was just going to ask you again.
Well, look, forget it. Look, I'm not an actor, you know. I can't go through this. The Americans was the first time I made a trip across the country, so it was the big change in my career, and it was at the right time. I mean, I would photograph a girl that's standing there with a towel around it, you know, that's probably what I would photograph. Today, it would turn away, you know, tell you the truth. It was his idea to make a film. It was a faultless film because Kerouac, with his genius for words, pulled it through. There was some optimism, I think, in the air. People didn't worry so much. They had some dreams, you know. It's different from now. Now there's no more dreaming, really. I did make up an image of living in a shack, you know. There's nobody around, and, you know, I have to say it's true.
Well, come to think of it.
Yeah, a true story. It isn't a pretty life, it isn't a sweet life, but it's the real life that I looked for and that I got. I'm a survivor.
So I want to touch on a couple influences he had growing up and going through that experience, developing his style. Jacob Tugner, he was an industrial photographer focusing on machinery and society, and he was publishing photos the same time Frank was in Switzerland studying and learning the ropes. So he took in some influence by him. Along with Gotthard Schuh, who developed a style called poetic realism. He believed the photographers needed to become completely absorbed in the situation in order to grasp it completely. He was a mentor to Frank, who more so stood back and observed the situation without getting too involved with the people he was photographing. A couple American influences when he came over here. Walker Evans, he also believed immersing yourself into the subject's life was important. He was another mentor of Frank. And we have Henry Cartier-Bresson, according to Frank, showed him the power of photography. He avoided staged photos and thrived in candid situations. These are some really nice shots. He proposed one of the most fascinating concepts of photography history, the decisive moment, which occurs when the visual and psychological elements of people spontaneously and briefly come together to express the essence of that situation. This resulted in some beautiful, meaningful, and powerful photos. Just being in the right place at the right time and understanding how to execute that. So in London. So Edward Steichen, he encouraged Frank to get closer to the subjects physically and emotionally, just like his other influences, just encouraging him to really understand his people he's photographing. He was another mentor to Frank in his younger years. He worked in the fashion magazine industry. So, in a way, kind of comparing Robert Frank, in a way, he resembles this French diplomat, Tocqueville, and he was a French diplomat, historian, and political scientist. He wrote a few books which analyzed the improvement living standards and social conditions, as well as individuals' relationship to the market and state in Western societies. He wrote these books published when he traveled to the U.S., observing and creating these ideas. One of his books was called Democracy in America, and so he traveled from France and just observed from afar, and kind of similar to what Robert Frank did, just with images instead of writing. So having that fresh, nuanced outsider's view on American society is really interesting and kind of a shock to American culture. Alrighty, and that is about it. I just have one more video for you to kind of touch on some more things about Robert Frank and his unseen photos from the Americans. These were the ones that didn't quite make it into the book. All right.
The 1959 publication of photographer Robert Frank's book, The Americans, was a milestone. It changed the world's perception of America and of art photography. Now an exhibit at the Cantor Art Center at Stanford sheds light on this seminal work. It features some images from the Americans and also dozens of rarely seen photographs taken by Frank at the same time that did not appear in the book. In 1955 and 1956, Robert Frank, a young Swiss-born photographer living in New York City, set out to traverse the United States. His goal was to capture America, its stark landscapes, and its ordinary people as they went about their everyday lives. Funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship, the year-long trip took him from coast to coast and back again. The result of this journey was a book of 83 photographs called The Americans. Published in the U.S. in 1959, it's widely regarded as one of the great achievements of 20th century photography. Raw and honest, the book depicts an unembellished view of America that was at odds with how most Americans were used to seeing themselves and their country.
After World War II, it was a period of great prosperity and great national pride, and that was naturally the outlook of the leading magazines, too. The book is very critical of the United States. America often looks bleak. The people often look distracted or bored or alienated. It's not a peppy promotional propaganda for the country the way most of Life magazine was. But remember, it's a work of art. It's not a piece of political propaganda. What often gets forgotten when people talk about the book is how exciting Frank's vital curiosity about the country is.
After the publication of The Americans, Robert Frank turned to filmmaking. But what happened to the thousands of photographs from his travels that did not make it into the book? In the 1980s, more than 150 Robert Frank prints were donated to the Cantor Art Center's permanent collection. Yet they've never been shown together in a formal exhibition.
This exhibition, Robert Frank in America, is really a landmark exhibition. I realized we had this incredible opportunity to showcase this work. I also knew that we needed someone who really understood Robert Frank's work, who really understood photography in a very profound way. We invited Peter Galassi to be the guest curator of this exhibition because of his deep knowledge of photography and the role he has played as one of the most important curators of photography in this country and in the world.
The Cantor Art Center has a great Robert Frank collection that's particularly rich in photographs that are not in Frank's book. There are only 83 pictures in The Americans, and it's a visual poem. It's not a compilation of his best pictures.
Now tell me about this show. How do you have this show organized?
It's Robert Frank in the 50s, and the show is mostly organized according to the themes. What did he look at? Ordinary people, religion, politics. But the key thing is the individual is sort of the building block of society. So that's one kind of picture he makes over and over again.
So what's unique about this show is that there are a number of photos that the public have rarely seen.
There are lots of very unfamiliar pictures here, even to experts, especially in the Cantor's collection. This is one of my favorites of them. This is the South in the time before the Civil Rights Movement. This is the Jim Crow South. Frank was a young Jew from Switzerland. He hadn't had any experience of skin color racism. He goes to the South, and it really hit him, the racial segregation. And about this picture in particular, he said that he just couldn't understand the fact that a white Southern woman would entrust their baby to the care of a black woman, but wouldn't sit next to them at the lunch counter.
There are also a lot of photos here that seem to have a political theme.
Yes, you're right. Because remember, he's trying to give a sense of the country as a whole. He felt that the sort of bombast of political rhetoric was something that he wanted to skewer a little bit.
And here, stylistically, he's got the people who are cut off. It's a very different style of shooting.
He was very good at selecting the telling detail. So here's the first picture in The Americans, but it's also a picture that shows one of his most powerful stylistic inventions. He brilliantly developed this template where you have one or two individuals who are trapped by pictorial forces that ends up being a very eloquent metaphor for lonely people trapped in social circumstances.
Why do you think these images still resonate with people today?
Well, I think that good art always has the potential to resonate far beyond its own time. In this case, he wasn't just working on a little problem. he was trying to understand the whole country. And he was trying to explore how does an individual relate to the nation as a whole. Well, that's something that never goes away, that we're still struggling with now. You see here a young artist of enormous talent figuring something out that he's passionately interested in. You can see it on the pictures on the wall while that's unfolding. I think that's thrilling.
All right. All right. So Robert Frank and his book The Americans was very revolutionary towards where we are today in our photography styles and inspirations. So yeah, that is Robert Frank. Thank you for listening.